The ballroom glittered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, each shard of glass reflecting a luxurious world built on power, prestige, and silent rivalries. In the center of it all moved Zara Hale, the woman whose name alone could shift boardrooms and unsettle entire departments. Wrapped in a deep crimson gown that shimmered with every step, she carried herself like royalty, poised, graceful, and impossible to ignore. People didn't attend the Hale Corporation gala for enjoyment. They attended because attendance was survival. One misstep in front of Zara could end a career, one well-timed compliment could elevate it. Conversations paused as she passed. Eyes followed her as if she were the axis around which the entire event spun. But the longer the night stretched, the more her perfect poise began to fray around the edges. At first, the changes were small. A stumble she quickly disguised as a dance step, champagne spilling a thin line over her wrist, a laugh too sharp to be natural. Most guests noticed, of course, but chose to look away. No one dared acknowledge that the iron-willed CEO might be losing control. Power, after all, was easiest to worship when it remained flawless. Across the room, standing near the edge where shadows softened the brilliant light, Omar Raza quietly observed. His suit was simple, worn at the cuffs, his shoes polished with care rather than money. In his hand was not champagne, like everyone else, but a plain glass of water. Unlike the others, he wasn't there to impress anyone. His world did not revolve around corporate politics, it revolved around his young daughter, Lena, sleeping miles away under the watch of a trusted neighbor. Omar avoided alcohol for a reason carved deeply into his past. The night a drunk driver had taken his wife's life. Since then, every sparkling glass at events like this felt like a warning, not a celebration. He stayed sober, always, because Lena deserved a father who would never slip, never disappear. His eyes drifted back to Zara. Where others saw a powerful woman at the peak of her success, Omar noticed something different: strain, exhaustion, and the slow unraveling hidden beneath her fire-red gown. The contrast between them was stark. She lived in a world of excess, he lived in a world built from responsibility and grief. Their lives shouldn't have intersected. And yet, fate had already begun to pull their worlds closer, one fragile thread at a time. As the night crept toward midnight, the ballroom slowly emptied. Laughter faded, conversations thinned, and the glittering crowd began drifting toward the exit, eager to leave before they accidentally witnessed something they shouldn't. Power was a spectacle people admired from afar, not a burden they wanted to carry. Yet Zara Hale remained. The woman who had owned every gaze now stood near the grand doorway, her balance wavering, her hand brushing the marble frame as though the building itself was her last source of support. Without her entourage, without the rigid structure of assistants and chauffeurs surrounding her, she looked strangely small beneath the golden light. Most guests noticed. None stopped. No one wanted to risk being present when the queen of the corporate world slipped. But Omar Raza couldn't ignore what he saw. He had spent years recognizing the signs of someone moments away from losing control, signs he had seen in the mirror on nights he tried desperately to stay strong for Lena. And now those same signs glimmered in Zara's glassy eyes. He set his half-finished water on a passing waiter's tray and walked toward her, steady and unhurried, as if approaching a frightened animal that might either collapse or lash out. "Ms. Hale," he said softly when he reached her side, careful not to startle her. "Do you need a ride?" She turned her head, pupils slow to focus. Recognition flickered faintly. "Omar Raza." Her voice slurred around the name, pride tangled in her words. "I don't need help. I have drivers. Cars. Everything." Omar glanced toward the valet stand, empty now, abandoned like the rest of the ballroom. "Not tonight, you don't," he replied gently. "Please. Let me drive you home. It's not safe." For a long second, Zara's expression tightened, stubbornness, embarrassment, and confusion warring silently. Her entire life had revolved around control. Accepting help, especially from an employee far below her, felt like breaking a rule she had lived by. But her fingers slipped slightly against the marble. And that was enough. With a slow, unsteady breath, she let her hand fall and nodded once, a surrender more honest than any words she could have spoken. Omar stepped closer, supporting her arm without making her feel small. Together, they walked through the grand doors and into the cool night air, two people from different worlds, their footsteps suddenly in sync. She didn't know it yet, but tonight would change everything. The night outside was sharp and cool, slicing through the haze surrounding Zara Hale. Her heels clicked once on the pavement before she swayed, and Omar Raza gently steadied her elbow. There was no judgment in his touch, only quiet responsibility. He guided her to his modest sedan, its paint slightly dull from years of use, its interior faintly scented with pine. It was nothing like the sleek luxury cars Zara was accustomed to, but tonight, it was the safest place she could be. She lowered herself into the passenger seat with a heavy exhale. For a moment, she stared at the dashboard, simple, worn, unpretentious, so utterly different from her world of polished leather and chauffeured power. The contrast stung more than she expected. Omar closed her door carefully, as though shielding her from the world. When he slid into the driver's seat, he buckled his seatbelt with practiced ease. "You should put yours on too," he said quietly. Her pride bristled, but her fingers still found the belt. The click echoed louder than she liked. For several minutes, they drove in silence. City lights streamed past the windows like smudged streaks of gold. Zara leaned against the cool glass, her breath fogging faintly. Her mind pulsed with fragments, laughter too sharp, eyes watching her stumble, a room full of people pretending not to see. "Everyone thinks success is glamorous," she muttered suddenly, her voice lower than she intended. "That power makes you untouchable." Omar's hands tightened on the wheel, but his tone remained calm. "Everyone has battles, Ms. Hale. Some people just hide them better." She turned her head slowly, studying him, this quiet man who had never once tried to impress her, never once sought attention, yet somehow saw more than those closest to her. "And yours?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated. The kind of hesitation that wasn't about fear, just pain. "My wife died," he said finally. "A drunk driver. Since then, I've stayed away from alcohol. Not for myself, but for my daughter. Lena deserves a father who'll always come home." The word struck her harder than she expected. Her hazy mind sharpened slightly, the weight of his honesty grounding her. "You carry that alone," she murmured. He didn't look at her. "Some things, you don't get to put down. You just learn to live with them." Silence settled again, but it was different now, heavier, deeper. For the first time that night, Zara didn't feel alone in her vulnerability. She wasn't sure why, but sitting in that ordinary car beside this unassuming man, she felt seen. By the time Omar Raza pulled into the underground parking of Zara's high-rise, the city lights had softened into a quiet hum. He stepped out first, circling to her side. When he opened the door, Zara blinked against the brightness of the overhead lamps, her exhaustion written in the slow rise and fall of her breath. "Careful," Omar murmured, offering his hand. She hesitated, but only for a moment. Her fingers brushed his before settling into his palm, surprisingly warm, surprisingly human. He helped her out gently, his touch firm but respectful, guiding her toward the elevator. Inside, the mirrored walls reflected two very different worlds, a woman draped in a gown worth thousands, and a man wearing a suit pressed more by responsibility than wealth. Yet for that moment, they stood side by side, equals in silence. On the top floor, the elevator doors opened to a penthouse that stretched like a glass palace above the city. The skyline glittered beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, but the space felt cold, immaculate, untouched, less like a home and more like a museum of success. Omar didn't gawk. He didn't slow down. He simply guided her to the nearest sofa, where she sank into the white cushions with a sigh she couldn't hide. "I'll get you some water," he said. He moved through the penthouse with the calm efficiency of someone who didn't want to intrude. When he returned with a glass of water set carefully on the low table, Zara looked up at him, her eyes heavy, her pride thinner than glass. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice rough around the edges. "You could have walked away. People do." Omar straightened, his posture simple, grounded. "Because I know what it feels like when no one stays." The words pierced deeper than anything she expected. She swallowed hard. The room didn't feel so cold anymore. He didn't wait for praise. Didn't linger. Didn't make her humiliation feel larger than it already was. He just stepped back toward the door. "Good night, Miss Hale. Rest." His voice was gentle, steady. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, no slam, no drama. Just quiet respect. For a long moment, Zara sat still, staring at the untouched glass of water. In the silence of her penthouse, surrounded by the spoils of success, she finally felt the weight of a truth she had spent years avoiding: no empire could keep her company. But kindness, even a stranger's, could. Morning sunlight pressed through the glass walls of Zara's penthouse, far too bright for the state she woke up in. A dull ache throbbed behind her eyes, and as she pushed herself upright, flashes of the previous night stitched themselves back together. The ballroom. The stumble. The unfamiliar steadiness of Omar Raza's arm guiding her. The glass of water he'd placed beside her. Her gaze fell to the table. There it was, still half full, untouched, a thin dried ring marking where condensation had pooled. It felt like the most intimate thing anyone had left for her in years. Zara Hale, the woman who commanded executives with a single glance, had leaned on someone who owed her nothing. Someone who hadn't judged, hadn't hesitated, hadn't taken advantage. A sudden wave of shame curled in her chest, sharp, unfamiliar. She was never the one who needed rescuing. Never the one who faltered. She had built an empire on being unbreakable. And yet last night, a single quiet man with a simple life had seen her more clearly than anyone in her world of power. But beneath the shame, buried in a place she rarely touched, something gentler stirred. Gratitude. She stood slowly, her footsteps echoing across the flawless marble floor. The skyline outside glittered with indifferent brilliance. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from the uneasy realization that she had been seen not as a CEO, not as a reputation, but as a person. Her mind returned to Omar's words, grounding and sincere, "Because I know what it feels like when no one stays." A man who had lost his wife. A father who stayed sober so his daughter would never feel the absence he carried. A man who didn't owe her anything but had helped her anyway. Zara drew a slow breath. She didn't know why she cared so much. Maybe because kindness so pure was foreign to her. Maybe because for the first time in years, someone had acted without agenda. At Hale Corporation later that morning, business ran with its usual precision. Assistants hurried, executives whispered, numbers flashed across screens. But when Zara sat at her desk, her expression unreadable, something in the room shifted. She pressed her intercom button. "Send in Omar Raza." Her voice held its usual authority, but underneath it flowed something rare, something her staff wasn't used to hearing: humanity. The request rippled through the outer office like a shockwave. Zara Hale rarely summoned lower-level employees by name, and never with such a measured tone. But a moment later, the door opened and Omar Raza stepped in, calm, steady, hands tucked behind his back in the posture of a man who expected nothing more than professionalism. "You asked for me, Miss Hale," he said, voice steady. For a heartbeat, Zara just looked at him. Not at his suit, a little worn, or his tired eyes that spoke of long nights caring for his daughter. She studied his steadiness. The same steadiness that had kept her upright the night before. "Thank you," she said, the word surprisingly difficult to release. "For everything you did yesterday." He nodded once, simply. Anyone would have done the same. No, Zara said quietly. Not everyone. Most people don't step forward when someone is falling. They step back. The truth hung between them, heavier than the morning report stacked on her desk. You showed me something I forgot existed. Her voice lowered. Kindness without a price. Omar didn't shift, didn't bask in the praise. He simply nodded again, accepting it without turning it into something more. I'm just glad you got home safely. Something softened in her gaze. That day, and the days that followed, the change in Zara was subtle but undeniable. During meetings, where sharp competition usually crackled among her executives, she began to pause. To think. And unexpectedly, to turn toward Omar. Omar, what are your thoughts? The room would fall into stunned silence before eyes jerked toward the man who had never once sought attention. Omar, uncomfortable under so many stares, cleared his throat and offered simple, grounded insights, nothing dramatic, nothing showy. But Zara listened. Sometimes she even adjusted her decisions based on his perspective. The whispers among the staff grew louder. Some speculated he had saved her reputation. Others suspected he was suddenly her favorite. Omar ignored all of it. He didn't care about rumors. His life revolved around getting home for Lena's bedtime. Yet deep down, he noticed the shift too. Zara started asking about Lena, genuinely, not out of politeness. She lingered after meetings just a moment longer. She didn't speak to him like a CEO towering over an employee. She spoke to him like someone, trying to understand him. Trying to connect. Trying to breathe differently in a life built on pressure. And Omar, despite everything he told himself, began letting the walls around his heart loosen, just enough for something new to slip through. The weeks slipped by, soft and steady, like pages turning in a book neither of them realized they were writing together. Zara Hale, the CEO who once spoke only in clipped commands, now paused at doorways, lingered by windows, and found her gaze drifting toward the one man who never tried to impress her. And Omar Raza, the man who had spent years guarding his heart behind grief and responsibility, felt something unfamiliar settling into his life: space. Space for softness. Space for someone new. One evening, as the sun dipped into the horizon and turned the Hale Corporation tower into a silhouette of glass and gold, Zara closed her office and stepped into the hallway where Omar was packing up. "Walk with me," she said. It wasn't an order. It wasn't even really a request. It was more like an invitation, one he couldn't refuse. So they walked out into the city, the streets alive with the hum of traffic, the soft glow of street lamps painting warm halos on the pavement. Zara wasn't surrounded by assistants. Omar wasn't rushing home. For once, there was no agenda, no pressure, only quiet steps matching each other. They talked less than they listened. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was comfortable, like an exhale that had been held back for too long. At a crosswalk, their hands brushed, a small, accidental touch that sent a ripple through both of them. Omar pulled back out of instinct, out of caution. His heart belonged to a little girl. His grief still had roots. But Zara paused. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached again. This time, she threaded her fingers between his. Omar froze, looking down at her hand in his. Soft. Warm. Real. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Zara didn't smile, but her eyes softened in a way he had never seen. For the first time in a long time, yes. They began walking again, fingers intertwined. No rush. No promises spoken aloud. Just two people, one learning to trust again, the other learning to let someone in. The city roared around them, but inside that small shared space, there was peace. Omar glanced at her. "Lena would like you." A slow breath escaped Zara's lips, fragile and hopeful. I'd like to meet her. And as they continued toward the fading sunset, their shadows stretched ahead, walking not as a CEO and an employee, not as two broken stories, but as two hearts finally stepping toward the same future.